welcome back to Industrious. I'm your host, Micaiah Shaw, and this week on What's Been Happening in Micaiah's Brain, we will be discussing gardening and what I am learning currently about it. It's a very full topic, as I'm sure anyone can guess. There's so much to learn about, and I'd like to talk about some of that here today. I would say growing up, we never had much of a garden at our house. We had tiger lilies and tulips that came up every year, but other than that, we didn't have any specific garden at our personal house, my family's house. However, both of my grandmas were very into gardening and still garden a bit. My mom's mom always focused on flowers in her garden, flowering plants and things like that. Hanging baskets of petunias were always along her stairs going up to her front door. And my dad's mom grew vegetables and fruits really, really well. So I remember as a little girl seeing their gardens and always thinking that was a very, very neat skill to have, being able to grow things like that. And I learned a bit from both my grandmas. I remember different times where I attempted a bit of a garden. There were different projects that I picked up with my grandma, helping her plant annuals in her garden that would only be around for one season, and those were hit or miss on how successful they were. Sometimes they'd be too crowded, sometimes they'd get overwatered or underwatered. It's a learning curve, that's for sure. But then growing up, after my younger childhood, we were in the military, so in military housing on posts, we didn't have the opportunity to garden in our yards, so gardening just wasn't a big part of my life. Now that I have a house myself, gardening has become a little more of a possibility and something that I'm very interested in trying to tackle. Trying my hand at it, it's definitely going to be trial and error sort of project. But last spring when we bought our house, we were just kind of waiting around to see what sort of things would bloom in our yard that's there already. And there have been an interesting variety, I would say, of perennials that have come back over the year. So we've got some beautiful flowers, some not so beautiful flowers, some ivy that is actually the worst, and then some climbing plants that have beautiful flowers on them, and I love them. So it's been really interesting to see what different things the previous owners had chosen to plant in this yard. We had a massive patch of irises that, while I think irises are beautiful, it was just weirdly set in the middle of our yard, and it was this clump of tall greenery that bloomed for a minute, and then it was back to tall greenery and just this weird circle patch in the middle of the yard. So last summer, Eric, my husband, dug out all of those irises, and we thought we could plant them again somewhere else if we wanted to, but we discovered upon trying to dig out all of the iris roots that they had been planted in order to hide a particularly tricky little stump in there. So that was a little bit of problem solving, I think, on the last gardener's part. But we got rid of that, and now our hill in our yard is very clear of all of that stuff. And this year, as we've gotten into the spring and summer, I have tried planning a garden a bit. I've wanted to plant some vegetables and berries, and so far I've drawn up a few different plans, but I have learned from my research that I've been doing that my planning started way too late in the season for what I wanted to try. So for right now, our garden patch includes 11 strawberry plants and 2 tomato plants and 1 pepper that unfortunately met its demise a little early from being smushed accidentally. But no worries, we'll try it the next time, and I'm not even sure how well peppers would have done in our northern climate anyways. So I have just found it to be such an interesting world to peek into because there's just so much information on gardening. There's so many different veins of gardening that you can get into. So for myself, I'd love to have a vegetable garden going, especially vegetables that we use frequently. And then flowers are also wonderful, and I'd love to be organized enough and knowledgeable enough to be able to plant a flower variety that blooms kind of in succession throughout the spring, summer, and early fall seasons. I think that would be so fun to have just different things flowering all throughout the year, something fun to look forward to. Um, Really, there's a lot that I don't know, is what I'm learning as I dive into it. So far, it's really been problem solving in our yard. I have dealt with some ivy. Like I mentioned before, we had some pretty gnarly ivy trying to take over the posts of our deck, and so I had to fight that monster back in our garden last summer, which was quite interesting. And I have discovered that I did not get enough of the root system out, apparently, because it's back, and I'm going to have to wage that war again shortly. But I also have a peony bush that I love, and I have looked into it because the process of taking cuttings and propagating plants from plants that you already own is so fascinating to me. And I've tried it a little bit with indoor plants, which I know is a little different than outdoor plants, but I have found some information on peonies and being able to separate them into multiple bushes and growing more peonies from the peony that you have. So I'm interested in trying that. I'm a little worried because I only have one peony bush and I love those flowers so much. But I have looked into it and found that if you dig up the whole bush's root system, you can kind of separate it at the roots. So you're not getting small little cuttings. You want a good amount of root ball with each of the cuttings. So I'm going to see if I can try to figure that out this summer. We'll see how that goes. The one other project that I've tackled so far in our yard. Right now we are in the midst of a deck renovation, which you all will hopefully be seeing a video of shortly. It's been a project that has drawn on since we're doing it all ourselves, and with any renovation there comes problems to be solved and new and daunting challenges that come along with it. But one of the first steps in our deck renovation was I had these rose bushes that ran along the portion of the patio that we were going to be extending and also building around, so they were just going to be in the way. But I had these 5 rose bushes that were actually, they had very pretty blossoms on them last summer when I saw them bloom. They just looked very unkempt, like they hadn't been cared for in a long while. So after looking up some videos and talking to my mother-in-law, who has a very beautiful rose garden, I got some very helpful tips from both of those sources about how to keep pruning them back to keep them producing. And my mother-in-law told me right before the fall to just cut them way back, almost all the way to stumps, so that they can grow fresh next year. So they had done a good amount of growing through the early spring, but then we had this deck project coming up, and I was looking at them, and they were right in the path of that construction zone. So I did a quick YouTube search to find someone who could give me some information on transplanting them, because I thought, why not? Let's try to save these rose bushes since they're already here at the house, and I know I like the blooms on them. I was like, we might as well try to save them and not just throw them onto the burn pile. So I looked up a YouTube video. I looked up a few, but the one that I settled on was this man who looked like he was not very comfortable in front of the camera, but he looked like he definitely knew his stuff about gardening and roses. And he was saying the first thing that you need to do when thinking about transplanting roses is look at your calendar. You don't touch your pruning shears, you don't touch a shovel, you look at your calendar, and there are only 2 times per year that you can move roses. And I was looking at this video, I think it was the last weekend in May, maybe it was a little earlier than that. it was maybe the first weekend in May or something like that, and he was saying that you can only do it in the spring or the fall. And I had basically what it was. I can't exactly remember the right dates now, but I looked at my calendar and realized for my zone, my climate, I had about one weekend in which to do this project. So I was out the next day nervously digging, trying to get my roses out of the ground and into the ground in another portion of our yard in the one weekend that I had. And my husband was looking at me like, why are we rushing into this? What's happening? What's going on? And I told him, I have to get these in. They're supposed to be done by, tomorrow. And we're going to have these warm days. And I was just very concerned about them. Turns out Moscow, Idaho has a good deal of fluctuation in its season, so I probably would have been okay for a little bit longer. But I was able to dig out 5 rose bushes and move them, thankfully not very far, but I just moved them into a different position along our driveway out of the path of the new deck. And they are firmly settled there now, and I can say that 4 of the 5 were successfully transplanted and are blooming and are green and are happy from what I can tell. One of them, the one that's still close to the deck area, has, I think, been stomped on a little bit in all of the hubbub of our renovation project. So that one, I don't know if it will survive. We'll see. I'm interested in the concept of actually shopping for roses and finding a bush that I would actually really love to have and picking one out and not just using the ones that were already here at the house. So we'll see. I think that might be okay if I have to replace one of them. But that was my first successful gardening venture in this house. Since then, I've had my strawberry plants really take off. I got 10 starts or cuttings from a friend's garden. She was trying to space out her plants a little bit. They had grown a little wild. So she gave me a few cuttings and I popped them in a planter box. I've got these 3 beds along the side of our house, and so I popped them in there. And I was like, well, we'll see if they grow at all. But she gave me a helpful tip saying that strawberries love acidic soil or slightly acidic soil, so she uses pine needles to get that acidity level. So I texted my mother-in-law and asked, hey, do you have any pine needles? And she's got a whole forest full. So I went over with a couple trash bags and collected some pine needles to go on my garden bed, and my strawberries have really taken off. We've already picked 2 strawberries this season, which my 2.5-year-old was thrilled by. He was very proud of himself for waiting the 2 extra days that I told him we saw red berries, but they were not quite soft. So I told him we need 2 more hot days and then we can pick them. And he was very, very excited to be able to pick those off of the bush and eat them. He looked at me and said, I waited, and was very proud of himself. So that's been very rewarding for both of us, for him to see how these things come to be in our refrigerator in cartons, big, red, juicy berries. It's exciting to see where those come from. My 2 tomato plants, we'll see how they do. There are lots of little blossoms on them, but no fruits yet, so we will see. I'm interested. Really, I am winging all of it, and I'm not sure what I'm doing, but I'm very excited to see how it goes. This year, we've chosen very low maintenance items, just trying to see how I do on the gardening front, but I'm hoping that I can get together a little more of a plan for next year and get better at starting things at the right time in the season, making sure I have something ready to go before it's actually planting and growing time. And I'm very excited to see that take shape. Also, it'll be nice to only have a garden to focus on and not have the deck project on top of it. I think that's what has broken up my concentration on the outdoor section of our home. We've really been focusing on that construction project. But I'm hoping to get some beans, maybe green beans, going in that garden next summer. It'd be nice to have more of the salsa ingredients on hand. My mom has done a salsa garden before, but that was after I had moved out of the house, so I was never able to enjoy the fruits of those labors except when I was on summer break. So I'd love to try out those sorts of things. And then I'm also looking forward to planting flower beds along our fence that we will build at some point around our yard. So there's multiple facets to our backyard that we will want to be improving in the future. And I'm just looking forward to researching and learning more about this whole world. And I'm sure learning through a lot of trial and error will do a lot of that as I learn about this completely new world of gardening. There's just so much you can delve into, and I am very blessed by the world of technology that we live in, because everything is really a Google search away, and I have found a few different sites and YouTube channels and other things that have been very helpful for me, Instagram accounts that I follow, to just learn a little bit more, collect a lot of information, kind of add it to lists that I can then pull from next year and see how well things will go. And I'll try and link some of those things on my Instagram page for Industrious so that you all can maybe take a look at them. Some of the Instagram accounts I follow, some of the YouTube channels that I take a peek at every once in a while. They're really helpful resources, especially if you have any very beginning interest in gardening. I am very much starting from the bottom on gardening, but happy to take in any information that anyone's willing to share with me. So, here's your exhortation to try out gardening, even if it's something small. When we lived in an apartment last year, or before we bought our house, the only thing I gardened outdoors was a planter full of mint that I threw in mojitos whenever we made them, and that was very satisfying, even though it's the easiest thing. Mint will grow under any conditions, basically, and take over any amount of space you give it. So it was very, very low maintenance, but very rewarding in my mind. So it is exciting. It's something to try your hand at. And who knows, maybe you'll have a really green thumb, maybe you won't. It doesn't have to be a super expensive endeavor around here. There's lots of people who have flourishing gardens that are happy to give a helpful tip or hand over some cuttings that are taking up space in their gardens. So it's worth looking into, and I am excited to see what comes of it, of this trial and error process. So I hope this was an enjoyable episode about gardening adventures, and I will see you next time. Bye.